Alright, now that we've got our mouths working, let's shift our focus to the eyes. Now, eyes are obviously one of the most expressive parts of the face, and although they're not as complicated, mechanically speaking, as a mouth, if you want to get a full range of motion from all of the movement capable in the eyebrows, upper and lower eyelids, and the pupil of the eye, the rigging can start to get a little complex. And again, just like with mouths, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. So we're again going to start with some basics, and similar to the mouth rigging, we're going to be using a combination of replacement with mechanical techniques. Let's start right out of the gate where we left off in the last video with our farmer man here, and we'll look at more of a straight mechanically based rig for his very, very simple eyes. Now, the significant thing here is that he has no separate eye whites and pupils, and the eyes are just simple little dots. Now, this occurs often enough in character design that it's worth sort of talking about as sort of a separate rigging situation, although the basics of eye rigging are pretty much the same no matter what. So the first thing we need to do is set up an aim control so the character can look around. Even though there are no eye whites, we really want to treat these basically as if they were pupils and allow them to move around in the face in the same way the pupil moves around when the eyeball swivels around in the eye socket. So let's set up our eye aim control. Now, this is something that could be done with a point slider on the head controller, but this is one area where I prefer to add another click and drag control. I think it's a little more intuitive. The other thing it does is allow you to split off some of the effect controls that start to really accumulate on the head controller. When you get into fancy facial rigging, you end up with a ton of controllers on the head controller. And by having a click and drag eye control, you not only get that intuitive aim control, but you get another controller you can stick your various eye and eyelid and eyebrow controls on, and it helps to spread those out a little bit. So let's set this up with a click and drag controller. So I'm going to first just make a controller without having anything selected. We're going to turn it green, name it eyes, and then I'm going to position it by first kind of putting the anchor point just over one or both of the eyes, getting eye level here. And then I'm just going to hold down the shift key when I click and drag this away, and we'll just drag this out a little bit till it's sort of a comfortable distance from the face. We don't really need the anchor point in any particular place, so we'll just leave that in the center. Now, we want the eye control to move along with the head, so let's parent the eye controller to the head controller and then just zero it out right away. Now that we've got our controller set up, let's go ahead into our head comp. Since we're going to need to tie these eye positions to the position of this eye controller, we need to click and drag this head comp timeline window down to the bottom so I have both timelines open. And here we can scroll this up, make a little more real estate here. Now, here in the head comp, we first want to set the anchor points of the eyes. So for both of these eyes, we want the anchor point quite low on the pupil. We'll explain why in a little bit. There's a good reason why we're going to do this. We'll get to this a little bit later. But we need to get these anchor points set right now, so let's get this done. So again, we're putting the anchor point near the bottom of the eye shape. Not all the way at the bottom, but near the bottom. And let's kind of compare these two. I should make sure they're pretty much the same. Okay, with that done, now we can zero out the position of both of these eye layers. This is really the nice thing about this zero out script, is that with the values zeroed, it's really, really easy to tie these things together with expressions, and you avoid having to add extra code in order to deal with the different position values. So this should be pretty obvious here. We're going to option click on the position value of each of the eye layers, and we're going to tie that to the position value of the eye click and drag control. Now let's go back here and see how this works. Now I can click and drag and it moves the eyes around. But notice that I'm actually having a really hard time. It moves like a lot. I just move this a teeny bit and those eyes are moving all over the place, because right now it's just a direct ratio of position to position. And from an animator standpoint, this is kind of hard to control. It's sort of clumsy and kind of swinging wild. So what we need to do is add a little bit of math to these expressions to tone this down so the eyes don't move so much when the controller moves. And this kind of fine-tuning of controllers with the expression code can really help make your rigs a lot more user-friendly and intuitive. So let's try this now. So let's first try taking this down by just about half. Let's just take it by half. So at the end of this expression, I'm going to divide by 2. And I'm going to do the same with the other one here. Divide by 2. So now when this position controller moves, we will get half the value here on these eye layers. So let's try this. Okay, that feels a lot better. It's a lot easier to control, but you know, it's still kind of crazy. Again, I want something that allows me to pose these eyes subtly without having to be too fussy here. So let's quarter it. So we're going to divide these now by 4. And let's try that out. There we go. That feels good. Now I can kind of swing this controller around pretty freely, but the eyes kind of stay on the face mostly. It feels a lot more natural. Now that's a great, very, very simple way to set up an eye aim control. And most of the time you're going to want to move the eyes like this, with both eyes moving at the same time. But if you have more complicated expressions to create, and in particular if you have to do a lot of kind of crazy cartoony expressions, you may want to have individual control over each pupil's position and not just have both of them move in tandem at all times. Again, probably 99% of the time this is what you're going to want. But what if your character gets hit on the head and goes cross-eyed or has googly eyes because they're going crazy or something? Then in that case you may want individual control over the pupils. And it's actually a really fairly easy thing to set up here. So let's kind of go back here a little bit and let's set up individual controls for the pupils. But what's cool about this is that we'll also be able to still have our single controller that moves both eyes. And I think again that's very important because that's what you're going to be doing most of the time. So let's go back a few steps here and re-rig this so that we can control each pupil individually. And again, if you don't need that, just set it up like this. This is a really nice simple way to do it. Okay, so let's look at how we set up that dual control. Let's walk backwards a little bit here. Let's first take off these expressions from our eye layers. And we're going to alter our position values a little bit here on these eyes. So let's also unparent them from the 0 nulls, and let's also delete the 0 nulls because they're going to have to be recreated. Okay, then we're going to hit the controller button to create a null object, and let's go ahead and name this eyes aim. Now this eyes aim null, we also want to have 0 position values, but we don't need to use the 0 script because it doesn't matter where this is. It doesn't have to appear as a click and drag. It doesn't need to share an anchor point with anything. It doesn't matter. So what we can do here is literally just type in 0, 0 into its position value, and it'll jump up to the top corner of the screen. Once that's set at 0, then we're going to parent both eye layers to that null. And now once again, we're going to reset the 0 values on those 2 eyes. But it's really important you do it in that order because when you parent these to the aim control, it changes the position value. So now if we move the position of this aim null, it moves both eyes. But we also have the ability to move both eyes individually on their own layers. So now let's go back to the eye controller and let's add a couple of point controls. Now, like we looked at in the mouth video, please remember that anywhere we use a point controller, you could substitute an X and a Y position slider instead, if you prefer that. Or you could add 2 more click and drag controllers for each individual eye if you prefer that. And again, this starts to get heavily into personal preference once you start to know the different options. For this, because it's a rare controller, it's not something you're going to use a lot, I think point controllers work just fine. So let's go ahead and add a point controller, and we'll change the value to 0, 0. I have a bad habit of control clicking on this and going to edit value because of doing it with the sliders. That's just one of my weird quirks. Just so you know, I can just type in 0, 0 here. I don't need to go to that edit value. Now you do need to do that to change the value range of a slider, but you don't really need to do it with a point controller. Okay, and we'll call this right eye position, and then we'll duplicate that. Change it to left eye position. Let's lock our effects control window, and let's go ahead and hook this up. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take the position of the eye aim null, and we'll connect that again to the position value on the eye controller. And let's remember that we want to divide that by 4, because we still want that tuning that we had before. So we want this 1/4 of the value of this. And now just so we can see here, now we've got our eye aim controller just like we had before, working just the way we had it. But now we can also take these position values for each individual eye, and we'll tie those to the individual point controllers. And now, when I click and drag, I can move the eyes around as a group, but I can also move one eye individually. Now, what's also really nice about this is it can potentially fix problems with perspective. Like if you want him to look over this way a lot and see how this eye is now creeping into the ear, you could pull that eye back now a little bit so it's not creeping into the ear so much, and that feels a little more natural, but you get the extreme look to the side. So it's a good way to kind of correct for some of the weirdness that happens in 2D faces that are trying to sort of simulate some sense of volume. But it also allows you, again, to do things like crazy eyes, googly eyes, and so on. So it's a very nice control to have and pretty simple to set up. Now, besides the ability to look around, we pretty much always want our eyes to be able to blink. Now, I would personally call this essential. One thing that any animator will tell you is that even a character that is hardly moving at all, even a character that is not moving, literally not moving at all, if that character blinks once in a while, the audience will believe they're alive. In more limited animation where there's a lot of still poses and not a lot of movement, blinking is critical to keeping those characters looking alive and breathing. And blinks are also really important for facial expressions and facial performance. Now, in a lot of cases, you're going to use replacement animation to create eye blinks with separate art for your eyelids. That's what we're going to look at in our next rig. And that could be set up for this farmer, too. We could create artwork of a little eyelid that comes down over the top and covers the eyes. With this character, we could do that either with a sequence of replacement eyelids, or we could use vector art to create a mechanical eyelid rig. But I want to show you kind of a fun little trick that I like to use with these very, very simple button or dot eyes that gives us a kind of simulated blink, but also gives us some additional expressive control kind of all at once. And what that's going to be is a squash and stretch control, just like the squash and stretch control we used in the mouth and the torso videos. And that's also why we set our anchor point so low on these eyes. So let's go back into the head comp here and open the scale value for these eyes. And let's zoom in a little more here. Now here's why we put the anchor point so low. On a human eye, the upper eyelid does most of the work when the eye opens and closes. And you can go in the mirror and check this for yourself. The upper eye travels a long distance from the top of the eye to almost the bottom of the eyeball, while the lower lid just comes up to meet it just a little bit. It's pretty lazy. Now we're exaggerating this because we're in an exaggerated environment. It's not probably nearly as dramatic as what I have here. But whenever we create eye blinks, we want to favor that upper eyelid and have that doing most of the work most of the time. Now here we're going to simulate an eye blink with squash and stretch. So again, we want to put our anchor point low on the eye so that when it squashes and stretches, it reflects that greater movement of the upper eyelid. Also, we're using this as kind of an expressive tool too, because we'll also be able to stretch the eye, and that'll give it sort of a surprised look. And even if we're not looking at this as a simulation of blinking, if we're just looking at this as just a way to add expression to the eyes, and we're going to add this later on to our more complex eye rig in a little bit, we still want that anchor point pretty low in the eye, because not only does the upper eyelid do a lot of the work in opening and closing the eye, the eyebrow and the forehead do more of the work in facial expressions rather than the muscles underneath the eye. So if we were going to stretch our eye out in a surprise, we'd be stretching up from the bottom, not stretching down into the cheekbone. So with that anchor point set, we can experiment with some values here, and I'm going to guess it's going to be pretty extreme to get it to blink. And here, we'll turn the resolution up a little bit here. And you can see as we pull back that the extreme squash looks like he's closed his eye. Now I think that's working pretty good. It's roughly the same thickness as the mouth and the eyebrows. Let's maybe take it down just a little bit further. 185 and 15. Now that's a little too much. I think we got to split the difference. There, I think that works pretty good. So 180/20 will be our squash. 180 will be our stretch. And that'll be kind of crazy stretch, but we want them to be equal distance, so our 0 point is neutral. Now again, I could use that triple value code to noodle that, but really not much need to. This can be done pretty simply, and having a little extra stretch capability, why not? So let's go ahead and add squash and stretch control to both of these eyes. Now, you've seen squash and stretch control before, so we're going to kind of speed through this. I'm going to add a slider control to our eye controller. We'll set the slider range from -100 to 100. We'll option click on the scale value for the first eye and paste in our 2-value translation code. We're going to pick whip to the blink slider and then enter in our extreme squash and stretch numbers into the C and D values. And because we're using the same squash and stretch values and the same slider, we can actually just copy and paste this whole code onto the right eye. Okay, and now our quote-unquote blink control, which is really a squash and stretch control, and you could name it that if you wanted, but I call it blink because that's more intuitive, I think, for the animator. But now I can blink the eyes by just sliding down to -100, and I can also stretch the eyes up to get kind of surprised expressions when I slide up from 0. And of course 0 puts us back to neutral. So kind of a fun little trick for simple eyes like this that also gives you some really fun expressive control. Now this works great, but you may want to have individual blink controls for your eyes. And this is a little bit like the aim control, where most of the time you're going to want to blink together, but you may want your character to wink. Right now he can't wink, he can only blink. Now unfortunately this particular little trick of mine of using a squash and stretch control actually adds some complication to this that will make it hard for us to have both a single blink control and individual blink controls the way we have with our eye aim control. In the next rig where we're doing replacement blinks, we actually will be able to get both a single blink controller for both eyes and individual blink controllers for right and left eye. We'll be able to do that with a replacement rig. But we can still add individual eye blink controls to this rig as it is, and we'll only add one additional property you'd need to animate when blinking both eyes at once. And we'd gain the ability to wink and create many more expressive poses with the eyes. And we can set this up very, very easily. In fact, we have very, very little we'll need to do here. So let's first take this slider and change its name to right blink. Now once I do that, notice that After Effects puts this little message up here, fix to expressions. It's automatically changed that name in our code. So you can see now this says R blink. And now we can just duplicate that right blink controller and just change it to the left blink. Now down here, in order to get the left eye to respond to that left blink controller, all we have to do is change the R to an L in the code. And boom, now we can blink that individually. Alright, so now we have right and left blink control. And again, if we wanted him to blink both eyes, we would just have to animate the two sliders together. In our next rig, we'll set up dual control so we can blink both at once or individually as we wish. So some nice, simple mechanical eye controls for this farmer here. We're going to come back and rig up his eyebrows a little bit later, but let's keep our focus on the eyes and look at a little more of a complex eye rig using replacement animation for the eye blinks. Alright, let's unlock our effect control window. Let's return that head comp to our main timeline window, and let's jump ahead to our hipster man. And we've already got quite a bit of the eye rigging done on the hipster man here. We've got most of one eye done, and we're going to be kind of finishing it up to go over these different techniques. And you can see that we've already got an eye aim control in place, and you'll note that it's got, oh my gosh, a lot of effect controls on it. But frankly, this is what happens when you start to push your facial rigging into an area where you can get a lot of different expressions. You're just going to start to accumulate a lot of controls. Now you'll notice that we already have a master blink control and then right and left blinks in place. So we're going to set up that dual control. And we also have aim controls for both right and left, as well as the aim control for both eyes. Now let's start by getting our blinking set up. So let's go ahead into the hipster's head comp here. And we've already got the right eye partly rigged, so let's focus on the left eye here. You can see that we've got it divided logically. There's a eye white piece here, and then there's a pupil piece. And then we have a sequence of eyelids from eyelid 1, 2, 3, and 4. Which animates the eyelid closed. Now the number of blink frames here is sort of arbitrary. You could do a blink with just one. You could just turn off and on one layer if you wanted. Or you could have a bunch of little increments of the eye opening and closing. The more frames you have, the slower you can open and close your eyes smoothly. So if you need something like that in your animation, then you might want to put more frames in, or you might want to try to look at some kind of more mechanical option. 4 will allow us to do quick, fast blinks and slightly slower opening and closing of the eye. So this is going to be a replacement rig, so we're going to set this up just like we would have set up one of those replacement hand rigs. We're going to duplicate the 4th eyelid to use as a guide. Then we're going to pre-compose the other eyelids together. We're going to crop the pre-comp. And then we're going to arrange these so that there's a new eyelid every 10 frames. Now one difference here between this and the hand rigs is that we don't want an eyelid at frame 0. At frame 0 there should be no eyelids in the neutral position. So we actually want to go ahead and slide these all forward by 10 frames. So that at frame 0, there is nothing. And then, of course, we also want to extend out that very last frame just so we have something in the timeline so it doesn't go blank if the animator has to scroll past 40. Okay, back in our head rig here, let's go ahead and solo these layers. And you'll notice we can't see our eyelid because we're at frame 0, so we'll just scroll ahead until we can see that eyelid. And let's reposition this. Okay, and just like we did with our hand selector, I'm going to go back to our main rig comp here, and we've already got blink controls set up here, so we're just going to lock that effect control window. You'll also notice that we've limited all the blink sliders to 40, since that's the last frame of our blink where the eye is fully closed. Back into our head here, and then on our eyelid comp, we're going to add our time remapping. Now in an ordinary circumstance, we would just choose whether we were going to tie this to the main blink slider, which would allow us to blink both eyes together like this, or we would connect to the left blink slider if we wanted individual control over the eye blink. But what if we want both? What if we want to be able to blink each eye individually and be able to blink them both together? Well, there's a really pretty simple and straightforward way to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to option click on that stopwatch again, and we're going to pick whip first to that left blink slider. Now let's remember to divide this by our frame rate, and now as we move the slider up and down, it'll play back that frame from that pre-comp, giving us a different eyelid position every 10 frames. And of course, because of that slider limitation, we get this nice, neat situation where when we slide all the way up, the eye is closed, slide all the way down, and the eye is open, which is nice and intuitive. Okay, so now we have that individual control working, but how do we add in the master blink controller? Well, we do just that. We're going to add it in. So let's go down to this code here, and right after the divide by 24, we're going to add, with a plus sign, the other slider, which we're going to use our pick whip to grab. And then, of course, we still have to divide by our frame rate. So what's going to happen now is that the value of our time remap will be this slider value plus this slider value. So if this slider is down here at 0, and I go ahead and turn up the main blink slider, it adds that value to 0, making that value what we want for our blink. So we can blink all the way shut and all the way open on both eyes. But of course, we can also still blink individually using these controllers, because now we're adding this value to 0 on this controller. Now what's slick about this too is that they'll actually kind of work in tandem. So let's say, for example, you've got one eye half lidded, because who knows why, but you have one eye that's partially lidded and one eye that's more fully open. You can have it set up like that, and you can still turn the blink all the way up. Boom, it'll still blink both eyes, because it's just adding 40 to 23 and 0. So we still get an eye blink, and then when you open it back up, it goes back to whatever the original blink was set at. Very, very, very flexible, and a really, really simple little bit of code to get this done. All right, now that we've got our blinks working awesome, let's go ahead and set up our eye aim control to move these pupils around. But before we do that, we need to set some anchor points and do a little parenting, because we're going to set up dual control for the eye aim. So we'll have the click and drag main controller, and then we'll be able to position each individual pupil. But we're going to set this up just a little bit different, so we can also add eye squash and stretch controls to these eyes to expand our range of emotional expression. So first, let's get our anchor point set here on this left eye white layer, and this is going to be kind of the base layer for our eye. And we want to put this anchor point once again low on the eye, because pretty much everything with the eye is going to be going up from the base rather than down into the cheek, as we said earlier. And I just want to check this against the other eye to make sure we're kind of in the same area in terms of the position of that anchor point. That's maybe a little bit lower there, so we'll match that over here. Okay, now the pupil automatically has its anchor point in the center. That's going to work just fine for us, so we're going to leave that. But then the eyelid comp that we just created, that we want to snap to the same anchor point as the eye white. And then we want to parent that eyelid comp to that eye white layer. Now some of this, again, is preparation for our squash and stretch control that we'll do in a little bit. Now in order to get both our dual aim control and individual squash and stretch over each eye, we're going to need to set up this eye aim just a little different than we did with our simple farmer rig. With the farmer rig, we just created one simple null that both eyes could follow for the master aim control. But here we're going to have to create one for each pupil. And the reason for that is we want the pupils to respond to the squash and stretch that we do with the overall eye. In order to do that, we need to have the pupils part of our parenting chain leading back to these eye white layers where we're going to put our squash and stretch. And that's not going to work if both pupils are parented to one null. But it will work if each pupil is parented to its own null, and that null is then in turn parented back to the eye white. That way we can put all of our expressions in that we need to control the eyes with the click and drag control and these position controls. But when we squash and stretch the eye, the pupil will go with it. So let's go ahead and set this up. So we're going to select each pupil and simply make a controller right at that point. We're going to parent each pupil to its corresponding null. Then we're going to parent those nulls back to the corresponding eye whites. And just so you can see what I mean, if I now adjust the scale of that eye, the pupil now goes with it. But we have the opportunity now to put expressions on all of these different position values. But first we want to zero everything out, so let's zero all these out. And since we're going to need to tie these nulls to our click and drag controller, let's drag the head comp down and put it at the bottom of our window here. And we want to open up that position value on the eye controller. And now we'll start by connecting the master controllers here. So each one of these position values we will tie to the master click and drag controller here. And now if we click and drag that around, our eyes move around. Now this definitely needs some tuning too. A quarter worked pretty well the last time, so let's try that again. Yeah, that works pretty good. I think the only thing I'm unhappy about is that I have to kind of move the controller right over him in order to get the eyes all the way to the other side. So let's maybe take it down a little. We'll do it by thirds. That's a little better. It still covers his ear a little bit, but it's not quite as intrusive. Alright, so there is our main eye aim control. That's working good. Now we want to connect our individual pupils to the individual controllers. So option click on each one and tie those in. So now we can move the two eyes together and we can move the two eyes individually so we can create goofy eyes. And again, this all works together in tandem, so it's a pretty nice, simple system. Now before we move on, I want to take a look at another situation. Our hipster guy, his eyes are pretty much the same size, and there's not really a sense of perspective on them. But sometimes you're going to get characters with a really strong sense of perspective from one eye to the other, so that one eye is much bigger and one eye is much smaller. So let's take a look at that situation in this little example here. So here we have a big eye and a small eye, as if we have a character in a three-quarter view with a lot of perspective. And we have a controller set up here, but here's kind of the problem. If I move the controller around, like let's say I want him to look up, notice he's looking up with this eye, but this eye hasn't actually made it to the edge of the circle. And same if I look forward here. If I want this at the edge, that's not quite at the edge, and so on. So they're not really working all that well together. Now I could add an individual eye control like we just did in order to compensate for that, but that would be a huge pain in animation. To have to do that every single time you looked around, it would make this control hardly worth the effort. But you'll also remember how we've been tuning our controllers by dividing the values, and we can multiply the values and do whatever we want, all kinds of simple math, in order to tune the controllers to feel more intuitive. We can also do it to correct for differences like this. So let's take a look. I've got my two expressions here linking these position values to the position value of our controller. And what I want to do is I want to limit the right pupil so it doesn't go quite as far as the left pupil does, so they'll match up a little better. So we'll start by just kind of guesstimating this a little bit, and we don't want this like halved or quartered, so let's do something like divide it by 1.5. Now when I click and drag in the controller, oh, you can see much closer. Now when I'm at the edge here, I'm just over just a little bit right there. And they're almost meeting up at the top. This is going to be a tough one because the eyes are a little oblong. We're never going to get this perfectly perfect. Okay, this is quite a bit better, but it's maybe a little too much. So let's try 125. Oh wow, that's really, really close. Still just a little bit off there though, going side to side. It's actually working pretty good up and down. But let's try just getting it a little bit closer. Let's sort of split the difference and do 1.35. There we go. This feels a lot better. Those eyes are almost exactly in the right position on each eye. Okay, very, very good. All right, so you can see how we can use this kind of quote-unquote tuning not only to make it just feel better, but also to compensate for differences in artwork like this. So let's go back to our hipster man here. There's one last thing I want to talk about before we add our squash and stretch control, and that is the layering of the eyes. You'll see if I move the pupils beyond the eyes, they just cross right over outside of the eye whites into the cheeks. Now, of course, you just don't have to ever animate it like that. And in some character designs, putting the pupils slightly outside of the eye whites is part of the style. And it is something that, if you study animation, cartooning, it is something that is actually suggested by many animators and illustrators and cartoonists as a way to make a look very exaggerated. And you can see here, this really looks like he's really looking over there, okay? So you may want this. You may want the pupils to sit on top of all of this eye art. But you also may not, or it may not support the art style. You may want those eyes to actually stay inside the eye whites as if they were real pupils rolling around on the eyeballs, staying inside the eyelids. So let's look at how we can fix that if that is what we desire. And again, we're getting into options here. So what we want to do is we want to duplicate these eye whites. So I'm going to duplicate this eye white here, and I'm just going to add matte after it. And we're going to slide this up above the pupil art, and then just simply make an alpha track matte. Now we also want to make sure that this matte moves when we do our squashing and stretching, so we also want to parent that matte layer to the original eye white. Now ordinarily that would be all you would have to do, but because we actually have some of this already rigged up, we have one little thing we have to fix. Now let me make it clear, you ordinarily wouldn't have to do this, because usually you would take care of this before you added your squash and stretch controls. We already have squash and stretch controls on this eye. That means that when we copied and pasted this eye white layer, we also copied and pasted the expression code on the scale value. Now we don't want that because we want this to simply follow that eye white layer. We don't want it to be reacting also to that expression code. So we just need to delete that, and if you're following along with me, make sure you do that so you're sure your eye works correctly. But again, that's not normal. Usually you would take care of this before you added squash and stretch. We haven't added our squash and stretch yet. We're going to do that after we get this matte set up. And now, when we move that eye, it will stay inside the eye white. This is an option you can use if you want that. But it absolutely depends on design, taste, and so on. So as long as we've done the one eye, let's go ahead and do the other one. So we're going to, again, duplicate the eye white, move that above the pupil, add an alpha track matte to the pupil, and then parent the matte back down to the eye white layer. Alright, we're almost done with these eyes here. We just need to add our squash and stretch control. You don't need to see this in detail. We've now done this squash and stretch control a bunch of times. And you can see that we've actually already got our squash and stretch set up on the right eye. So just to make things a little easier, let's do a little copying and pasting. So this code is going to be very, very close to what we need. There's only going to be one difference. So let's copy that and paste that in. And all we've got to do is change the R to an L to match our slider control up here. And now we have squash and stretch control over both of the eyes. The squash and stretch control is really nice for more cartoony and exaggerated kinds of animation where you're doing takes and bug out eyes and stuff like that. And it just adds another whole level of expressive capability to your puppet. Now, because we are working with time remapping for these blinks, we need to take some extra precautions to make sure we don't have any frame slippage when this is animated. So what we want to do for these comps is to open the composition settings, go into the advanced setting, and check preserve frame rate when nested or in render queue, just like we did when we started working with the replacement rigging for the hands. Now I want to do that here in the rig comp. I want to do that here in the head comp. And then we want to go into both eyelid comps and get it set there as well. Let's also go ahead and lock the unneeded properties here on our eye controller. And of course this is one that doesn't need rotation, it's just position value is all we're interested in there. And now we're almost done with this face rig, we just have to do the eyebrows. But we're going to come back to these eyebrows in a little bit. But first let's jump back to our farmer man and let's talk about getting his eyebrows set up. Now, eyebrows are very important in terms of generating different facial expressions. Not all characters actually have eyebrows. In fact, you might notice that we just added eyebrows to these characters for this lesson. But if your character has to do a lot of emoting, a lot of acting, I actually really recommend that you try to design eyebrows in because it can really help with that kind of emotional performance. Now, eyebrows on a human face are quite flexible and posable. They don't really move around all that much, getting pulled around by the muscles there at the top of the eye and the lower part of the forehead. But if you go into the mirror and make every kind of goofy facial expression you can think of and try to make every kind of emotion you can think of and really exaggerate it, you'll find your eyebrows do a lot of crazy stuff. They pinch in the middle and they go up and they go down and they kind of arch and they can kind of arch up and they can kind of arch in a little bit when you're very sad or anguished. So they kind of slide around up there pretty freely, and they really have a lot to do with the way our facial expression looks. So for rigging eyebrows for animated characters, particularly fairly exaggerated ones, the first thing that we want to do is just have some basic position and rotation control. And in many cases, this is really all you need, is just the ability to move the eyebrows around a little bit and rotate them so you can pitch them different directions for mad looks, sad looks, and that kind of thing. Now, the biggest movement that eyebrows make is up and down. So if you're putting together an extremely simple rig, you really only need to have up and down movement on the eyebrows, just movement in Y. But because it's so simple to add, I tend to always add movement in X as well, because again, I like to give a lot of freedom to the animator to play around and, bringing the eyebrows together when they're tilted upward can look like the forehead is pinched in deep thought or despair. Moving the eyebrows a little bit out towards The edge of the face in a surprise can help accentuate that surprise, so you move them up and out a little bit, can really exaggerate some of that stuff. So it's nice to have and easy to add in, but certainly not necessary. So if you do want that one simple Y position control, I would recommend in that case tying that to a slider control that just slid up from 0 to 100 and down from 0 to minus 100, and we'd set that up just like we set up the slider control for the mouth on the hipster woman in the previous lesson, with the 3-part translation code, and then setting some limits for how high and how low it went. If we did want to add that extra X position control, we could either add a second X position slider or use a single point controller for both. Or you could even use a couple of click and drag null controllers to position and rotate each eyebrow. But I wouldn't really recommend that unless you're rigging a close-up head, because I don't like having a lot of little nulls crowding up the face. But you can of course set up your interface however you want to. And as we keep saying, that's part of what I want to communicate to you is you have a lot of options. I'm trying to show you a lot of different ways you can approach these things, and it comes down again to the needs of the production and the taste of the animator. So we've already talked about creating that sort of limited slider control in that mouth lesson. So to keep things simple and just to keep fewer controls in our effects control window here, I'm just going to do point controls for the position values, and we'll of course do angle controls for the rotation. Now another option we have here is where do we actually put the effect control that we're adding for the eyebrows. It could either go on the head controller along with the mouth controls, or it could go on the eye controller with all the eye controls. This is again very much a personal preference thing. I think it makes a lot of sense to put the eyebrow controls on the eye controller, since you're generally going to be wanting to kind of pose all of these elements all at the same time. So let's go ahead and rig this up with some simple position and rotation controls, and because we've seen these so many times, we're just going to speed right through this. So we're going to add 2 point controllers and 2 angle controllers to the eye controller null. We're going to zero out the point controllers, then we're going to lock our effect control window, and then we're going to zero out the position values of both eyebrow layers. Then we'll simply tie the position and rotation values of the right and left eyebrow layers to their corresponding controllers. Okay, now we've got some nice, simple eyebrow control here. We can raise and lower the eyes and rotate them and get all kinds of facial expressions. Now just a note here, if you did want that dual control, in other words, one controller that controls both eyebrows, you would just set that up just like we did the dual eye aim control here. You just make a separate null object, set it at 0 position, and then parent the eyebrows to that, and then add an additional point controller, master point controller, and tie that together, and then you would have one controller that would move both eyebrows, and then individual controls for each one. That's not one I tend to add, but again, it's absolutely about what makes the most sense to you and what makes the most sense for your character. Now this kind of control is actually pretty adequate for most situations. You can see with just a couple little twiddles of knobs, I get pretty dramatic emotional changes pretty easily. But if you actually went and looked at your eyebrows, they do actually bend and deform quite a bit. So if we wanted to kind of push on these eyebrow rigs a little bit, we could add some deformation to them. Now in the case here of a vector character, we can do this pretty easily with the shape layers. Now we've actually already done this sort of secretly here, so let's open these up and take a look. So if I open up the contents here of both of these eyebrows, you see there's actually 2 eyebrow shapes. And if you open up that second eyebrow shape, you'll see that we've actually created a path animation. We've done that on both of these here in order to deform the eyebrows. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to turn off eyebrow shape 1 and turn on eyebrow shape 2. And now you can see our eyebrows are dipped here, so they're very sad looking. But if we animate forward here, scrub through, you can see the eyebrows straighten out here in the middle for our neutral. and then they arch up here at frame 20. Now, just like we've done with mesh warps, and by the way, this could have been achieved with a mesh warp too, or the puppet tool. But in the case of vector art, it's so easy just to animate the path and you get a really clean, controlled animation. So we can now, just like we did with our mesh warp animations, we can now tie this to a morpher slider and then tie that to a slider control so that we can deform these eyebrows as we wish. So we're going to start by adding two -100 to 100 slider controls, and we'll name these appropriately. Alright, and with our controllers in place, let's go ahead and add our morphers. So we're going to select our keyframes on our left eyebrow here, add our morpher, and we want to name that morpher right away. And we're just going to copy that name since it's going to be real similar to the one we use next. And we're going to delete all but the middle keyframe here and slide that to frame 0. Then we'll do our other eyebrow. Okay, and just as we've done before, we're going to option click on the slider property, paste in our 2-value translation code, pick whip to the slider, and change the D value to 20. And because this code is going to be so similar to the other, we'll just copy and paste the code into the other morpher slider and just change the L to an R in the code. Now we can dial up and dial down the deformation of these eyebrow shapes, and you combine that with the rotation and the position control, and you now have a really wide range of expressions available to you with these eyebrows. So we've got a really nice, really entirely mechanical face rig for this farmer here. Let's go ahead and kind of finish things up. We want to lock all of our layers here just to be safe inside the head pre-comp. And then inside the main rig comp, let's be sure and lock those properties that we don't need. Okay, let's take a quick look at the eyebrows on our hipster man. And once again, most of our work has been done for us. Let's unlock the effect control window here and go back to our hipster guy. And you can see we've already added a bunch of eyebrow controls, and these are all hooked up except one of the shape controls. So we already have eyebrow position controls and eyebrow rotation controls, just like we have on the farmer man, but let's also add those shape controls. And we've already got our sliders set up here, but we'll do these a little different since this isn't vector art, since this is raster art. We kind of have two choices. We could either do a mesh warp, which would work just fine, or in this case, I thought the puppet tool would make a lot of sense since it's such a simple deformation. We really just have to bend these simple little eyebrow shapes here. Now this is one of the extremely rare cases where I use the puppet tool without using our bone script. I pretty much do this every time, but this was such a simple situation, really wasn't necessary to have separate null objects. So let's take a look at this. Let's open up these eyebrow layers, and you can see we've already got the puppet in place. And you can see the right eyebrow is already done, so we're just going to focus on finishing up the left eyebrow. Now a couple quick notes about creating the animation of your eyebrows going up and eyebrows going down. You'll notice that both in the case of the farmer and here with our hipster guy, note that as we animate these, the ends of the eyebrow basically stay in place and the middle of the eyebrow goes up and down. Now this makes the most sense because we also have position and rotation control, and you don't want this movement of bending and arching the eyebrow to actually move the position of the eyebrow overall. We're really just trying to change the shape of the eyebrow, so we're kind of pinning the two ends. But you'll also notice that the two ends stretch out and curl back in so that we kind of maintain the volume, the overall volume of the eyebrow. But again, this was just created very simply with 3 puppet pins. No use for bones here, just built that simple animation on frame 0, 10, and 20, just like we've done with our mesh warps. And we're going to hook this up just like we did with the farmer. So let's go back to the rig comp here. Let's lock our effect control window. Make sure we can get at those eyebrow shape sliders. Back to our head comp, we're going to grab all that animation, run our morpher script, name the morpher, delete all but the middle keyframe, option click on the stopwatch, paste in our code, pick whip to our slider, and change our D value to 20. Now both of our eyebrows can once again be dialed up and down to create those different poses. And it's really the accumulated abilities of the position, the rotation, and the shape that give us very, very flexible and expressive eyebrows. So let's again finish this up by locking all of our layers. And we've already locked our properties there. And we've got two very nice flexible facial rigs for these characters. Now jump over to the exercise video where we're going to have you set up a couple different facial rigs and practice some of the techniques you've learned here.